Hello, I am Ghanwa Hakim, and you are watching the Arabic Hour. Today we bring you Joy Totah Hilden, author of Bedouin Weaving of Saudi Arabia and its Neighbors. Today's program features Joy Totah Hilden, author of Bedouin Weaving of Saudi Arabia and its Neighbors. Hilden is a recognized authority on Bedouin textiles. Her work is based on more than 12 years of residence in eastern Saudi Arabia and extensive travels throughout the Arabian Peninsula and points north. Born to a Palestinian father and an American mother, she spent her childhood in Palestine, where she observed the making of many crafts, including Bedouin weaving. She holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the San Francisco Art Institute, as well as secondary teaching credentials in art and English. She lives in Berkeley, California, and is presently completing a biography of her father, Dr. Joy Totah. Our guest interviewer today is Janice Hayden, owner of Folk Art Mavens, a small fair trade business importing handcrafted Palestinian gifts. Her interest in Palestine began in 1996 and 1997 when she was living in Jerusalem. Subsequently, she returned to the United States and pressed for equal rights for Palestinians through various forms of activism. Hayden founded Folk Art Mavens in 2003 to help Palestinian artisans gain market access in the United States. She travels regularly to Palestine and Lebanon to local Palestinian artisans. Meeting with embroiderers in villages and refugee camps has given Hayden a great appreciation for their work. To view her products and place orders, go to www.folkartmavens.com. And now, our feature interview.
Thank you, Ghanwa, and welcome to the Arabic Hour, Joy. It's a real pleasure to meet you. I've spent some time over the last few weeks getting familiar with your wonderful book and wondering myself what your life must have been like putting this book together. It's amazing. It's the work of a lifetime, really. Not only does it have the history of some of the Bedouin culture in Saudi Arabia, some of which is getting lost today, but also the incredible photography, and most of the pictures were done by you, the illustrations, which most were your own illustrations, and the personal narratives that you tell about the Bedouin weavers are just beautiful. It's not just a book about weaving, it's really a book about culture. And it opened my eyes to the culture in Saudi Arabia, the Bedouin culture. But let's start with who you are first, because you spent your early years in Palestine, and I'd love to hear about those early years and how maybe those early years sparked in you a passion for weaving that you took with you.
Well, I spent my first 9 years in Ramallah. My father was from Ramallah. He was the principal of the Friends Boys School, and it was a very stressful job for him. So for vacations, we used to go to an orange grove in Gaza. And near the orange grove, there was an encampment of Bedouins. And I used to like to go and see them. And one time I remember they were weaving. And I remember being so impressed by that. And I love textiles. I've always loved textiles of all kinds. So I think that was one of my earliest memories of weaving.
I think I also read in there, was it an uncle or a grandfather you had that also did some weaving?
My grandfather, my father's father, was a village weaver. He wove abayas and things like that. But I don't think I ever saw him weave.
Okay.
I was young when he died. But it's interesting nevertheless, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, exactly. And I guess you were also, you mentioned in the introduction to the book that you were exposed to basketry and embroidery. And and had a house full of traditional products in Ramallah.
We did. We had brass, carpets, embroidery, glass, the glass blown in Hebron. Oh. So I was very aware of all the crafts in Palestine as a child, and the pottery.
Now, to move at age 9 to the U.S. from Ramallah, that must have been quite a switch. Were you able to maintain your ties with Palestine? Did your family maintain its ties?
Well, they maintained ties, but I was 9 years old, and I was just moving ahead, just trying to adjust to being in the U.S. And we did live in Massachusetts for about a year. So we lived in different parts of the country during my growing up years.
Okay, and was it, your mother was from the Midwest, though?
She was.
And tell me a little bit about her and how she may have influenced you.
Well, my mother came from a pioneer family in South Dakota and Nebraska, and the tradition in her family was, that people made everything. Although by the time she came along, ladies were painting china and this more delicate kind of work. But they made quilts, they did tatting and crocheting, they sewed their clothes. My mother, as a young woman, used to hand sew her own lingerie, little silk lingerie hand-stitched. So textiles was an important aspect of life from the culture my mother came from.
And in your life in the U.S., was there a merging of those cultures, or were you pretty assimilated once you came?
I think the assimilation and the merging all kind of happened over time. By the time I was a young mother, I was promoting some of the embroidery from Ramallah. Oh. But we were quite assimilated. I mean, we already spoke English and went to schools here and went to a Quaker school in Palestine, so we were fluent in English, and my mother spoke English. So we didn't have a big assimilation thing to do, except about the country. The differences in Palestine and the U.S., it was quite considerable.
Yes. Could you talk about them a little bit?
Well, people were and still are ignorant about Palestine. They don't know the name of it. They don't know where it is. They don't know anything about the culture, the differences, the similarities, and of course nowadays the struggles with politics and occupation and so forth. But in those days, as a child, I would get silly questions asked of me like, did you live in a tent and did you ride camels? And I used to get so tired of these kinds of questions. I thought, what's the matter with these people? Don't they study anything about culture or geography in school?
And you haven't seen enough improvement in that over these years either, I'm sure.
No, just last night I had a run-in in Jamaica Plain, talking to a woman about a house. I'd gone to see a house that we stayed in when we first came to the U.S. And I was asking a woman about the house. I said, the previous owner was from Palestine. And she said, what's that? So things haven't changed a lot.
Okay. Now, your husband at one point got accepted for an English teaching position in eastern Saudi Arabia, and that's what brought you to Saudi Arabia in the first place. But I can imagine you may have had strong feelings one way or another when he was offered the position. And could you share those?
Oh, I was delighted.
You were?
Oh, yeah, I was delighted with the opportunity to go to Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And we thought we were going to be gone a year or two, but we stayed for 12 years.
Okay, so you were both delighted.
We both liked it. He liked the job, and I liked the ability to do my research.
Now, it's interesting because I think, most Western women would have been a little bit afraid to be going to Saudi Arabia, understanding the restrictions on females there. And reading your book, it's clear that it brought some challenges into doing the work. But you managed to get around a lot of those challenges. So could you tell us about that a little bit? Like, talk about your early visits to Bedouin markets, and your forays to meet the weavers that you talk about so beautifully in this book, and all the challenges in doing that.
It was so difficult. Our first encounters with weavings and weavers in the markets were pretty casual. We would take a trip with a group, or on a university bus trip, or just a carload of people, and I would talk to the weavers, and I would maybe ask them if they had yarn, or ask them if they had a spindle, or garn ghazala. It's a horn, an animal horn, used in the weaving process, and they were interested that I knew the words for things and that I knew something about the weaving. So I would go back. As far as going further out into the desert, that was harder. It was very hard getting rides, getting information about where I could find Bedou. And getting rides was a big deal. I learned to take advantage of any friends or acquaintances at the university who wanted to go to a Bedouin market and didn't know how to get there. I would say, "Oh, I can be your guide," because women can't drive there. So
these would be women friends who had drivers.
Or no, it would be maybe a couple or a family who wanted to go. And women who had drivers too, I would go to various things with them, but that wasn't as often.
And sometimes I guess your husband took you when he sat out in the car and waited.
Yes, if it was a home, like in Anak, he had to sit out in the car. He wasn't allowed inside. But when we went to markets, of course, men can wander around in the markets, so he would do that.
Could you describe these markets? Because in your book they sound like very exotic places.
Well, there are two kinds of markets. There are town markets where you go when you go to shops and arcades, like the bazaar. And then there was the desert market of Nairiya, and there were other markets in some of the other cities, where it was like a market that was originally for Bedouins, and they would like migrate through there in the spring of every year and set up shop, literally, and sell all kinds of things. The weavers sold anything to do with weaving. If they had yarn, they would sell yarn. If they had made things for the camels, they would sell those. If they had tent dividers, big pieces, huge pieces of tents, they would sell those. And maybe they had used it and they were through with it, and they would sell it. There were also things like fagga, which are truffles. And in the spring, they would sell them by the box. And that's a great delicacy. City people would come from the cities many miles to buy the fagga. And they sold brass, dallas, the coffee pots. They sold clothing from China, and sheep and camels, and cheese, goat cheese that they would make, and then they would squeeze it with their hand and dry it on the top of the tent or something.
Wow.
And then they would sell them dried. So there were many kinds of foodstuffs, clothing, and specialized things.
And from these markets, you try to take opportunity to meet weavers and then get it back invited to their homes so that you could actually see them weaving.
Oh, I tried. I mean, I seldom succeeded, really, in that. It was a good place to meet the weavers and buy their stuff and get to know who they were. I only got invited to one home, and it was because she wanted to sell me a tent. So the sale didn't happen because I was buying for someone else for a museum actually in the U.S. And they backed out when they found out how big and heavy it was. But any contact I could make with Bedouin whatsoever, I took. Whether it was in the bazaars in town, like in Hafuf or Qatif, or in this market. Or just traveling in the desert and you see a tent and you go, oh, okay, let's go there.
Yeah, oh, and you'd go there and be welcomed?
We might be welcomed. Yeah, usually people were pretty friendly. You know, they weren't usually hostile. I've had Bedouins be annoyed. Woman is busy cooking and doesn't want to be bothered.
Okay.
That kind of thing. I can understand that totally as a woman. But getting information about where Bedouins were and how to meet them was a big challenge, always.
And how did you get that information?
Well, for instance, in the eastern province, one of the tribes is the Al-Ajami tribe. And a shopkeeper in town who sold sewing goods and things like that, I was asking him for help, and he said, oh, well, people from the Ajman, the Ajami tribe, a lot of them live on this road to Nairia, between Judah and Nairia. And if you go there and go to this town of Judah, or you go to, I forget the name of the other town, you'll find some weavers there. So I thought, great. So we went, and we started knocking on doors. Yeah, I've done that in a number of places. And people were pleased that we were interested in their culture. And the women were delighted that someone knew about their weaving and knew how to talk about it in Arabic. So we did meet one of our weavers this way, by going to this one and then being sent to this one and then being sent to this one and finally meeting someone who took us to this weaver.
Okay. Now, you said that when you were in the markets and you try to get invitations back to homes, but it was impossible to get those in general. What do you think the barriers were?
Well, usually if you met a woman in the market, she wanted to sell you something. And if she invited you to her home, she would want you to buy something. So one of the weavers that I went to many times in Anak, she used to make things and sell them in the Souk al-Khamis, the Thursday market that's like their Saturday. And she made little rugs and little things that were similar to the old style things that people really used, but these were for decoration. And at the times when I went to her home to gather information, yes, she would give me information, but then she would want me to buy something. Or she would give me a little piece, and then she would expect me to buy something. And she was always doing this. Yeah, so it was important to her. She wanted, you know, it increased her sense of confidence, and it was affirming of her ability and her success as a saleswoman. She really enjoyed doing that.
Well, I can hear through the story and also from reading the book that the challenge of trying to get to meet the Bedouin women really helped develop you too, to develop your confidence, your persistence, you know, it changed you as a person.
Well, you're right. You're very perceptive. Yeah, I became much more bold and confident and willing to take chances. I knew that if I didn't just go ahead and do it, it wasn't going to happen. I had to, and it was adventurous. It was fun.
Yes.
And, you know, my Arabic isn't too good, but they were very tolerant.
Okay, now how does, you know, the Palestinian Arabic you learned, the Levantine Arabic, how did it compare to the Arabic you were trying to speak with these Bedouin women?
Different, quite different. Yeah, and the different tribes had different dialects. So I couldn't always speak with them easily, but they were very tolerant. They, you know, I would ask basic questions like, what is this? In Arabic. And they would say, this is blah, blah, blah. And I'd write it down. Or I would have a tape recorder. And then I'd go home and I'd study. So I had, you know, I taught myself.
Okay. What did it take to really get the trust of the weavers that you became close to? What did it take from you?
Just going back time and again and buying from them. And also, you know, having some kind of relationship with their family. Now, with the woman in Anak, Eid, I developed a relationship with her daughters. Her sons were not around. They did not interfere with us or facilitate anything for us. But Demtha, on the other hand, in Judah, we had a relationship with practically her tribe, you know, I mean, not only her family, but the extended family, all of whom were very open and very willing and very warm. Matter of fact, some of the ruling families of that village had a number of children, young people, who had gone to the U.S. to college. And so they were happy to talk to us. And so this developed confidence. And the fact that we came time and again and brought people with us, they became more and more open over time that way.
Okay. If I could go back a little further in the book, I loved your description of the origin of Saudi Arabian weaving, and I didn't realize how central the women were to the Bedouin culture, because they were the architects. They were the ones doing the weavings to make the tents. Those were all woven.
Yeah.
And they were also making the saddlebags, all the other furnishings. And there's one reading in there, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to do. It's on page 55, the first paragraph. It talks about their central role in the society, and you know, I was totally unaware that the Bedouin women had a more central role.
Oh, okay. This is the first paragraph of the chapter on weavers, chapter 3. Bedouin women enjoy a degree of freedom, autonomy, and responsibility, which urban women do not. They're depended upon for the majority of tasks necessary for survival in the desert. Theirs is the job of creating the tent and its furnishings. They erect and take it down at migration time. They own the sheep and goats and take care of them. Theirs is the eternal job of birthing and caring for children, as well as all the food preparation. When their men are away working in the military or on business, the women and children are left on their own in the desert and must know how to survive. They are the only women in modern-day Saudi Arabia who are allowed to drive, although this they may do only on the fringes of the desert, to have access to the provisions and services that villages provide. And you must remember that most of the research for this book was done, well, I started in the 80s and finished it like in 94, with a little bit added from Egypt later. But so things may have changed when I talk in the present tense in the book. It's that period when I was there.
Exactly. But if I had never been aware that they had a little bit more freedom, that they were, you know, even allowed to drive in their rural and, you know, desert environments.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, you know, and also it made me realize that when they moved from that nomadic existence and settled in some regions, they were giving up some of their power.
Yes.
And
They
it must
were.
have been very hard on some of them.
It was hard. Eid talked about it, that when she was 15, she moved to the city, and she missed the fresh air. she missed the freedom. Her children, when she was living in town, would say, "Oh, you shouldn't go to the market to sell, you know. That's not, you know, it's not cultured, it's not cool, whatever." And in the desert life, it wasn't like that. She was free to do what she wanted. Yeah. And she could sell in markets where men came by.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Eid?
Eid. Yeah. I met her at the time of the filming of a documentary about Bedouin weaving that was done for the English TV channel there. And the director was from Qatif. And Qatif had a little market. A lot of the women from Anak came to Qatif to sell their goods, whether it was baskets or rugs or whatever they were making. And so he went and just asked the women, would somebody like to, you know, be in a movie? Or some words to that effect. And Eid agreed, and so he filmed her showing me things that she was making and things she had made, and you know, demonstrating. So that was the beginning of my meeting with Eid. And I would be in touch with her by phone, and then I'd go away for the summer, and when I came back in the fall, maybe she had moved. And this happened with the Bedou. You know, they may live in town, but they still, moving is just part of their way of life. They pick up and go somewhere else. So she, one time I couldn't find her, and lo and behold, I ran into her in the bazaar, in the market, in the Thursday market. And I remember one time when I ran into her, and I said, "Where do you live? How can I find you now?" And she said, "I'll show you. So take me in your car." And this was unusual too. So she hopped in the car with her bundle of weavings and things, and we went to her new house, and I made a little map for myself how to get there, you know, Hansel and Gretel, you know, how do I find the place next time?
That's true, because there were no street addresses and
no street names, nothing. You know, oh, you turn left at the water tower or whatever. Yeah.
Beautiful. One thing that really struck me is when I was reading the book also is that you don't see women's faces in it.
Yeah.
There's only one woman's face in it, I believe, and she's from the Syrian desert. And the others, you see them in their, you know, their black garb. You talk a little bit about veiling in there, but I was really wondering how you could recognize these women when you saw them on the street, and then I came across some references to that you were trying to recognize them from their eyes, that you'd see through the eye slits, or from their size, their body size.
Their body image, the way they walk, the way they carry themselves. Like, Eid was usually at home when I met her, but even in the souk, I could recognize her. And of course, they would recognize me, and they would call out to me. But I could see how children could recognize their mothers. Size of the woman, the way she walks, her voice. And one day I was in a souk al-ghanam, a sheep market in Hafuf, and I saw a little boy that I knew. And I knew that the woman with him was his mom, Demtha. They had gone to buy a sheep. Yeah. That was how I figured it out, but children have their ways.
There were some lovely quotes you had in there from some of the women you got to know, and I know that we don't have time for all of them, but perhaps you can talk a little bit. You've talked about Eid from Anik, maybe about Shafia Lugma.
Oh, Shafia, yeah. Well, first, in the big souk in Nairia, the big outdoor souk. I met this woman. She was a big, imposing woman. And she had a tent, and she gathered stuff that her family, she told me it was family, I don't know, that her family was selling. And there was always tent dividers, you know, and they're huge, 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 huge. And other things, you know, tote bags and different things they made. Well, I asked her name. I always ask the names, you know, I write everything down. And she said, oh, my name's Lugma. Lugma, you know. And then another woman from the same tribe, Demtha, whom I met in her home. I used to talk to Demtha about Lugma this and Lugma that. Well, one day when I visited Demtha, she said, oh, Lugma is really, her name is really Shafia. They don't like to give their names.
Oh, why?
It's almost as bad as showing their face.
Wow.
It's identifying themselves in public. And a lot of times if I asked a woman's name, she wouldn't want to tell me. So this was a very funny example.
Oh, okay. Now there were some quotes in there about another woman that you met, Damtha. If you could maybe talk about her a little bit, and then on page 77 there was some, I think that's your third tab here. Yeah, that one.
Well, Demtha lived in this town called Judah, and there were people from her tribe all around that whole passageway, that whole road. She had many children. She had divorced her husband. He was much, much older than she. And I think he had started, you know, to show his age with dementia or something. And so she divorced him. But he still lived in the house, and all the children lived in the house. And then as they got older, you know, some of them like would move away, or one of them, one of the younger ones, Dalal, wanted to go to college and study religion. Well, they don't let girls go off to the big city like they do here to go to college. So Demtha and one of the boys moved with her to Dammam, the city nearby, and they got an apartment there so that she could go to school. And that's what, do you want me to read this little bit?
I'd love you to read it.
Demtha kept weaving during Dalal's college years, despite all the changes. I think that weaving gave her a purpose and a sense of self, a sort of center, which integrated into her family life regardless of where she was or what the circumstances were. Like Eid and other settled Bedouin, she adapted her weaving methods to the places in which she lived. In the first Dammam flat, she had no opposing doorways on which to tension her loom. You tension it on a pipe or a dowel or some heavy round like stick or something. No walled side yard, so she had a portable loom made out of metal rods. It limited her in the length and tension control of the weavings, but she was accepting about the accommodations she had to make, and proud to have invented a loom that she could put in the truck with her. In the second flat, she was able to stretch a small loom in the side yard. Her resourcefulness and positive attitude carried over into her social life. After a month of living in the city, she had met no neighbors and became very lonely. Saudi Arabian women generally stay within the walls of their house or compound. One day she encountered another veiled woman in the street and accosted her. She was immediately folded into the neighborhood social group. Yeah.
She just, the women come alive. in the story. And also the thing that comes alive is the resourcefulness. And in the book, somebody who really wants to weave, could pick up this book and put together everything they need to build a loom. You give enough information that people could learn how to spin from it. They could learn their dyeing recipes in there for making some of the natural dyes. And also there's information on the patterns that you see on some of these weavings. They're tribal patterns that are similar to the tribal marks that they put on the camels to identify them. And so, I had always imagined that the motifs had a different sort of meaning, but now you put it all together. So it comes together as a culture. It was beautiful.
You have been watching an interview with Joy Totah Hilden, author of Bedouin Weaving of Saudi Arabia and Its Neighbors. We will be back with more after this short break.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
There have been enormous changes over the last 30 years since you first went to Saudi Arabia. And the Gulf War has happened there. There have been changes to the Bedouin culture, and I'd love to hear about those changes.
What started happening, we went there in 1982, and they were still spinning wool and weaving with wool. There were some synthetics being used. As time went on, they started using more and more synthetics and less wool. By the time we left in 1994, it was hard to find wool hand spun in the markets. They would buy synthetic yarn in big lots and then ply it on hand spindles. It has to be very tight and very tightly spun and plied. So they would ply it very tightly and weave with that. And they thought that was just fine. They didn't like the fact that mice and moths ate the wool.
Ah, so that was the motivation for moving to synthetics.
That was one of them. The other was that it was easier. You didn't have to spin it.
And the cost was probably pretty reasonable.
No, I don't think so. I think the women who would use the synthetics probably had a little bit more disposable cash.
Okay. Now you mentioned how when you're actually working with the synthetic yarns, the tension is different and it's harder to get it correct, isn't it?
That's right. It is harder. Wool has stretch. Because it's spun so tightly, it's like a corkscrew. And you can stretch it quite tight and still bounce your hand on it. That's my test of, is it warped tightly enough? So I would bounce my hand on it.
Okay. And you expect it to spring back?
To spring back. With synthetic yarns, they don't have as much spring.
Okay. Now, I'm interested in what's been done to preserve the weaving and with it the culture, and to market products, and whether, you talked in the book about the various regions, who's doing efforts along that line, and if you could share that with us, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, there was not very much going on in Saudi Arabia when I was there in terms of encouraging Bedouin weaving. They brought in Turkish and Egyptian men teachers to teach them how to make kilims. But there was no encouragement that
So they didn't really appreciate their own weaving
No.
and their own tradition.
No, but in other countries they did. In Jordan there was some, and in the Negev in Israel there was some.
To Lakia there, which you've mentioned.
Lakia,
Yeah.
and in Kuwait they had a Beit Sedu house where they gave classes and had beautiful examples to sell and to show. Now, just this last spring, and this is 2012, sorry. This spring in April, I was invited to Saudi Arabia for an all expenses paid lecture tour.
Mm.
The country is becoming more interested in its culture. I spoke at universities and women's groups and all kinds of places about this subject, and they were rapt. They were very interested. So it may be that times are changing and that now there will be more interest. But of course, the lifestyle that created the need for these things is gone.
Right.
So
what does that mean in terms of products? If women are trained in the traditional weaving now, will they be making it to go in museums, or are they going to be?
No, the tendency seems to be to make items of decoration, or to make small things like purses or a trim for clothing, or a decoration to hang on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not functional as part of a tent.
Mm-hmm.
The rug or the saddlebag or the tent divider wall or anything like that. That's gone. Some women are still doing it. They'll do it if you pay them.
Okay, so it's commission work.
It's commission work for the most part, although I've seen pictures of new tent dividers. Even on the net, Google Pictures or whatever, something like that.
Oh.
You can see, not necessarily in Arabia, I don't know. You never know where those pictures come from.
And do you know if they're generally new or if they're used?
They look newish. They look new.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For instance, I was in Qatar on that same trip,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a big outdoor souk in a sort of a touristy area of Doha. And they had some new tent dividers and saddlebags and storage bags that were gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
They were beautiful. So it's kind of in a state of flux. In Saudi Arabia, I didn't do enough traveling in the markets and such to be able to see what they're doing out in the desert regions. But I did see that in Doha.
Okay, now we don't have a lot of time remaining, but I want to bring you up to date on the work you're doing now. And also I know that there's been a publication about your mother. I know there's a publication about your mother that you can share with us, and you're working on a biography about your father.
Right. So I kind of can lump all my work into the category of cultural preservation, of Arab culture. Mm-hmm. My mother was an American, but she went to Palestine at around age 30, met my Palestinian father and married him, and she wrote letters home every week or two. She typed them and made carbon copies. She wrote by hand. Her parents lovingly saved all her letters. Well, maybe not all, but most all. So we have those, and my daughter collected those letters, and she also collected my mother's autobiography that my mother had written by hand and had commissioned my daughter to edit and type.
Oh.
So by the time my daughter was in her 50s, Lila, she decided, okay, now's the time. So she put it all together. She put the autobiography together and the letters, and she also did a genealogy of my mother's family. So it's called From Prairie to Palestine, and the author is Lila May. She included some family pictures in black and white that she collected as a girl. You can't really see them very well in the camera, but there's pictures of my mother's early life and her later life, and it's interesting because it spans continents and it spans historical periods. She left. She arrived in Palestine in 1927, and she left in 1944. So basically, it covers that period. And she was a teacher. She went there to teach. She was going to stay a year. She did like we did.
Exactly, just like you in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, only she married the principal of the school and took on a busy new life. And it's interesting, you know, she loved the Palestinians, and this shines through her her autobiography. Beautiful. The other book I'm working on, I mean, I didn't work on this. This is my daughter's project, the autobiography. I'm writing on a biography of my father that is in the editing process now, and it will have quotes from diaries and letters, and it will include more in the way of politics and also in the life of my father himself, from childhood up to the time he died, actually. So, and his name was Joy Totah. He was one of the first PhDs in Ramallah, and he was very esteemed and admired, and the little history books he wrote, he was actually also the principal of a teacher training college in Jerusalem for, I think, 12 years. And on that job, that was during the British Mandate. He was born before the British Mandate, during the Ottoman Empire. Then came the British Mandate. And they didn't, the education department didn't have books. So my father wrote some books. He and other teachers, scholars, they wrote books for the boys in Arabic, you know, and they were just little books, but they were remembered for generations. I still have people who say, "Oh, Joy Totah, oh yeah, I read his book in school, book of history and geography of Palestine."
Well, I look forward to reading that biography when you finish it.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Joy. It's been a pleasure to be able to interview you. It's been a pleasure to read your book, and I hope we meet again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janice, and many thanks to our guest, Totah Hilden, author of Bedouin Weaving of Saudi Arabia and Its Neighbors.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghinwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.
Thank you.